Franklin Mercer, a stoic 91-year-old Vietnam veteran, steps into Crown Heights Bank to withdraw funds for his grandson's education, keeping a promise to his late wife. Mocked by the smug manager Travis and dismissed as a fraud, Frank sits quietly, his dignity unshaken. Unknown to the bank, his rare challenge coin catches the eye of Rachel Kim, a former Air Force specialist. She makes a call, and soon a black SUV screeches to a halt. A decorated general enters, saluting Frank, revealing his hidden legacy. What happens next will leave the bank, and everyone in it, forever changed. If Franklin Mercer's story of quiet honor moved you, join us in celebrating unsung heroes. Like, subscribe, and share this video to spread their legacy. Drop your own stories of respect or injustice in the comments. Your voice matters. Support our channel and keep these stories alive. Thank you. The bank manager's voice cut through the hum of the lobby, sharp and mocking, as he dangled a crumpled discharge form like it was some relic from a forgotten era. "You sure this account's even yours, old man? Looks like it was typed up back when dinosaurs roamed." A ripple of snickers spread among the tellers behind the counter, their eyes glinting with amusement. Franklin Mercer, seated by the window, didn't flinch. His weathered face remained still, his gray eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the glass. He gave a single, slow nod, the kind that carried the weight of a lifetime of patience. Soldiers waited. That's what they did. All he wanted was to withdraw a modest sum, just enough to ease the path for his grandson Peter. But instead he got this: scorn, dismissal, and the sting of being made small in a place he'd trusted for decades. Franklin's heart didn't race with anger, though. It ached with a quiet, familiar disappointment, the kind that settles into your bones when the world forgets who you are. Outside, the screech of tires against asphalt broke the moment. A black SUV lurched to a stop in front of the bank, its polished surface catching the morning light. The lobby fell silent as a man in full military dress stepped through the glass doors. His boots struck the tile with a rhythm that demanded attention, each step echoing with purpose. He was young, no older than 30, his uniform crisp, metals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Without a word, he crossed the room, his gaze locked on Franklin. The tellers froze, their smirks fading. The manager's hand, still clutching the discharge form, wavered. The officer stopped in front of the old man everyone had mocked, squared his shoulders, and saluted. The gesture was sharp, deliberate, and its sound rang louder than any apology could. Franklin's eyes lifted, meeting the officers, and for a moment the weight of his years seemed to lighten. What happened next would shift the air in that room forever, leaving every soul inside to reckon with the man they had overlooked. Franklin Mercer wasn't the kind of man who craved attention. He never had been. Born in 1934 in a small Nebraska farming town, he grew up under wide skies and hard truths. His hands were calloused by the time he was 10, shaped by hauling hay bales and mending barbed wire fences under a sun that offered no mercy. His father, a man hardened by the Dust Bowl, taught him to work without complaint, to find strength in doing what needed doing. His mother, softer but no less resilient, believed words were cheap. Silence, she said, carried more power than shouting ever could. Those lessons rooted deep in Franklin, shaping a quiet dignity that stayed with him through a world that kept changing faster than he cared to keep up with. At 18, when this draft called, he didn't hesitate. He went to Korea first, a young man thrown into a frozen, brutal war that left scars he never spoke of. Years later, Vietnam's jungles swallowed him whole, thick, unforgiving, and heavy with the kind of fear that clings to a man long after the gunfire stops. He didn't talk about those days, not to neighbors who asked, not to his children who sometimes wondered. Some truths, he believed, belonged only to those who'd stood shoulder to shoulder in places the rest of the world could never understand. Home wasn't a shrine to his service. No medals hung on Franklin's walls. No flags draped over mantels. Instead, there were photographs. Marie, his late wife, her smile bright even in faded Polaroids. His son, gone too soon to illness. His absence a wound that never quite healed. And Peter, his grandson, whose quick grin and sharp mind reminded Franklin so much of the boy he'd lost. Vietnam had changed him, not into a broken man, but a different one. He didn't chase the corporate ladder or join the veterans groups that pressed him to wear pins and march in parades. Glory wasn't his aim. Instead, he took a job as a county maintenance supervisor, fixing what was broken: school boilers, cracked sidewalks, sagging fences. His work was small, unnoticed, but it kept the world turning. And that was enough. He shunned email, ignored smartphones, and slipped away from holiday gatherings where old soldiers swapped stories of who served where. Noise didn't suit him. Duty did. Decades ago, when Franklin first opened his account at Summit Ridge Bank, he was fresh off a classified operation near the Laos border. The hazard pay, meager as it was, went straight into that account, untouched, like a vow he'd made to himself. Over the years, he added to it quietly, a few dollars here and there, as if it were a living promise to Marie. Before her cancer returned, stealing her breath and her light, she'd made him swear two things: don't let the world make you bitter, and when Peter was ready, help him in a way no one ever helped you. Those words were his compass. Even now, at 91, with knees that ached and a right shoulder stiff since a shrapnel wound in Da Nang, Franklin stood unbowed. His commitment to Marie's promises never wavered. Peter, now 18, had just been accepted into a state university's engineering program, a world of algorithms and robotics Franklin couldn't begin to grasp. But he understood the legacy. He understood what it meant to give a young man a chance to build something better. That account, untouched for over 40 years, wasn't just money. It was a bridge to Peter's future, a way to keep Marie's memory alive. On that cool Tuesday morning, Franklin woke with purpose. He brushed off his old black wig, the one with Vietnam veterans stitched in gold. Not for show, but because it felt right. He pressed his shirt, ignoring the frayed cuffs, and folded his VA card and discharge papers with hands that trembled only slightly. In his coat pocket, he slipped a brass coin, its edges softened by years of quiet handling. It wasn't a talisman or a trophy, just a reminder of who he was, of the man who'd survived wars and loss and still chose to show up. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't need to. Franklin wasn't at the bank to make a statement or prove a point. He was there to keep a promise, to withdraw enough to help Peter start his journey. As the glass doors of Crown Heights First National Bank slid open with a mechanical sigh, a gust of autumn air followed him inside, carrying the weight of a lifetime and the hope of a legacy yet to unfold. The morning air carried a sharp, crisp bite as Franklin Mercer stepped into the bank, his movements deliberate, each step a quiet testament to a life shaped by discipline. His boots, worn but polished, whispered against the sleek tile floor, a stark contrast to the frenetic hum of the modern world around him. The bank was a gleaming monument to progress. Glass walls, digital screens flashing stock tickers and savings promotions. Everything polished to a sterile shine. It was a place built for speed, for efficiency, for the young and the restless. Franklin, however, was none of those things. At 73, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that felt out of place here, like a relic from a bygone era. His coat, though meticulously pressed, bore the faint wear of years at its cuffs, and his hands, steady but trembling faintly from old wounds, gripped a cane that was more than just a walking aid. It was a silent anchor to his past. On his head sat a simple black cap, its golden embroidery declaring Vietnam veteran with unapologetic pride. In his pocket, a set of folded documents rested, their edges softened by time but their importance undiminished. Franklin took his place in line with the precision of a soldier falling into formation. He stood still, his posture unhurried, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the bustle of the lobby. The other customers moved around him like a current, phones in hand, earbuds in place, their impatience a palpable buzz. Franklin didn't belong to their rhythm. To him, waiting was not a burden but a practice, a small act of respect for the order of things. His patience was a vestige of a life where timing could mean survival, where stillness was a skill. Yet in this gleaming bank, that patience felt invisible, a forgotten virtue in a world that prized speed above all else. At the counter, Lena, a young teller in her mid-20s, greeted him with a smile that was warm but practiced, the kind of cheerfulness honed by training manuals and customer service scripts. Her eyes, bright with youth, flickered with a moment of uncertainty as Franklin approached. She was polite, her voice light and professional, but there was a hesitance in her movements, a lack of depth that came from inexperience. She didn't know the weight of the man standing before her, couldn't sense the history etched into his weathered hands, or the stories hidden behind his steady gaze. When she read the name on his account form, Franklin Mercer, her brow furrowed, a small crease of confusion. "Hi there, can I help you?" she asked, her fingers already hovering over her keyboard, eager to resolve and move on. "I'd like to withdraw from an old account," Franklin said, his voice low but clear, each word chosen with care. "It's under Mercer. Been a long time." He slid his ID across the counter, his hands betraying a slight tremor, not from nervousness, but from the ghosts of colder, harsher days spent in places this bank could never fathom. Lena took the ID, her eyes scanning it briefly before her fingers danced across the keyboard. She paused, her smile faltering, as the system returned an error. Something wasn't right. "I'm sorry," she said, clicking again, her voice tinged with unease. "This account's pretty old. Do you have anything else to verify?" Franklin nodded, his expression unchanging. He reached into his coat pocket and produced two creased documents, their edges yellowed but intact, his military discharge papers and a faded VA card. He laid them on the counter with the same reverence one might place an offering, his fingers lingering for a moment, as if reluctant to let them go. These were not just papers. They were fragments of a life, proof of sacrifices Lena couldn't begin to understand. She glanced at them, her frown deepening. The documents were unfamiliar to her, relics of a system she'd never navigated. Biting her lip, she raised a hand to signal her supervisor, her discomfort growing in the face of something she couldn't neatly categorize. Enter Travis Myers, the branch manager, who strode from the back office with the confidence of a man who thrived on control. His hair was slicked back with gel, his shirt cuffs rolled up just enough to reveal a gleaming watch that screamed ambition. His smile was wide but hollow, never quite reaching his eyes, which scanned the room with a predatory sharpness. When he saw Franklin, that smile twisted, taking on a subtle edge of disdain. To Travis, Franklin was an anomaly, a disruption to the smooth flow of his domain. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his tone clipped, as if the issue were already an inconvenience. Lena handed him the ID and documents, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I think it's real, but I can't find any of this in the system." Travis took the papers, his eyes flicking over them with a cursory glance before settling on Franklin. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that carried a hint of mockery. "You sure this account's yours, sir?" he said, dragging out the word "sir" until it sounded like a taunt. "This discharge form looks like it was typed during the Stone Age." Lena let out a nervous laugh, her cheeks flushing as she tried to align herself with Bear Boss's tone. Franklin didn't react. His face remained impassive, but beneath the surface a quiet storm churned, a mix of resignation and pride, the weight of being misunderstood yet again. He reached into his coat one last time, his movements slow and deliberate. From his pocket, he drew a small, weathered brass challenge coin, its edges smoothed by years of being carried, touched, remembered. He placed it on the counter with a soft clink, its surface bearing a Thunderbird emblem flanked by 7 star symbols, a mark known only to those who had served in the shadowed corners of military operations, where names were rarely spoken and deeds were never celebrated. To Franklin, it was more than a token. It was a piece of his soul, a silent testament to battles fought and brothers lost. To those who understood, it was sacred. Travis barely glanced at it. "Cute trinket," he muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Anybody can buy those online these days." He nodded toward the security guard, a young man who stood awkwardly at the edge of the scene. "I think we've got another wannabe trying to game the system." "Escort him out." The guard hesitated, his eyes darting between Travis and Franklin, sensing the weight of the moment but unsure of its meaning. That brief pause was enough to stir the air, to make the lobby feel smaller, tighter. Behind Franklin, a cough broke the silence, followed by a soft chuckle from another customer. A younger man engrossed in his phone, oblivious to the gravity of what was unfolding, but eager to join in the spectacle. To him, it was just another scene, a moment of someone else's embarrassment to lighten his morning. But for Franklin, it was something else entirely. He felt the sting of dismissal, the slow burn of being reduced to a nuisance in a place that should have honored his presence. Yet he didn't flinch. With the same quiet dignity that had carried him through jungles and firefights, he picked up the coin, slid it back into his pocket, and turned toward the exit. He walked to a bench by the window and sat, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the floor. The silence that followed wasn't shame, at least not Franklin's. It was a heavy, uncomfortable tension, a void where respect should have been. In that gleaming lobby, no one realized they had just dismissed a man who carried scars deeper than they could imagine. Franklin sat, his thoughts a tangle of memories, of mud-soaked boots, of comrades who never made it home, of a world that had moved on without him. He didn't need their validation, but the weight of their ignorance pressed against him all the same. Lena, still at the counter, felt a flicker of unease, a nagging sense that she'd missed something vital. Travis, already turning back to his office, felt nothing but the satisfaction of a problem resolved, and the bank hummed on, oblivious to the quiet tragedy unfolding in its midst. In the bustling lobby of the Crown Heights Bank, the air was thick with the hum of routine, keyboards clacking, voices murmuring, and the occasional chime of a phone. But for Rachel Kim, the scene felt like it had been yanked out of time, suspended in a moment that prickled her skin with unease. She stood 3 people back in line, her morning ritual disrupted. Normally, her routine was a well-oiled machine, a double espresso from the corner cafe, a quick stop at the bank, then up to the 3rd floor of her defense technology consulting firm for a day of encrypted briefings and relentless meetings. A former Air Force logistics specialist, Rachel had spent years honing a life of precision and discretion, her military career a tapestry of quiet efficiency. She didn't draw attention, didn't cause scenes. But today, something shattered her carefully curated calm. Her eyes caught on an old man near the window, his weathered hand sliding a small, glinting object across the counter. To the untrained eye, it was just a brass token, maybe a collector's trinket or some military-themed keepsake you'd find on a website for enthusiasts. But to Rachel, it was a lightning bolt. Her breath hitched, her pulse quickening as memories flooded back. Memories of a secure operations briefing at Andrews Air Force Base years ago. She could still hear the faint clink of a coin hitting a metal table. The room falling silent as a retired JSOC colonel entered. 7 stars etched into the Thunderbird design, a bishop coin, not a souvenir, not a novelty, but a symbol of something most would never understand. Deep operations, the kind that lived in the shadows of redacted files known only to those who had been there. That coin carried weight, not just of metal, but of sacrifice, of missions that altered the course of history in ways the world would never fully grasp. Now, watching Franklin Mercer, though she didn't yet know his name, stand at the counter, Rachel felt a knot tighten in her chest. The smug bank manager, Travis, barely glanced at the coin before rolling his eyes, his dismissive gesture cutting deeper than words. He waved for security, his tone dripping with condescension as he muttered something about confused old men. The words landed like a slap, not just to Franklin, but to Rachel, to the legacy of service she carried in her bones. This wasn't just an insult to one man. It was a dismissal of a generation that had shaped the very freedoms this bank operated under. Franklin, with his quiet dignity, didn't flinch. His posture was steady, his face unreadable, but Rachel could sense the weight of his silence. A man who had seen the world fracture and still stood tall. Her heart pounded, a slow burn of anger rising in her throat. She couldn't stand by, not this time. Rachel stepped out of line, her polished heels clicking against the marble floor, each step fueled by a mix of duty and outrage. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the lobby's awkward hum. Travis looked up, irritation flickering across his face. "Sorry, miss, this doesn't concern you," he said, his tone clipped, as if she were just another inconvenience in his day. Rachel's gaze didn't waver. She pointed to Franklin, still seated by the window, his hands folded calmly in his lap. "That man isn't a fraud," she said, her voice steady but laced with steel. "That coin alone outranks every paycheck in this building." Travis gave a short, derisive laugh, his arrogance practically tangible. "If he's so important, why isn't someone here with him?" he shot back, his words careless, oblivious to the gravity of what he'd just dismissed. Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her mind was already racing, her instincts kicking into gear as she turned and strode out the front doors, the cool morning air hitting her face. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't touched in years, one burned into her memory from a life of classified briefings and unspoken trust. The line crackled, and a voice answered, all gravel and command, General Abbott's line. It's Rachel Kim, she said without hesitation, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. I need to speak to him directly. It's about a Bishop coin, Crown Heights Bank. He's here. There was a pause, a heavy silence that spoke volumes, then a simple hold. No questions, no need for clarification. Rachel stood on the sidewalk, her eyes locked on Franklin through the glass. He hadn't moved, his calm demeanor unshaken, as if he'd faced worse than a smug bank manager and come out the other side. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone was coming, and when they arrived, this bank wouldn't be prepared for the weight of what they represented. Miles away, at Fort Lockage, the morning hummed with military precision. A regional security briefing was in full swing, the room alive with the low buzz of urgency, projectors casting maps across white walls, aides rattling off troop rotation schedules, the air thick with the scent of coffee and purpose. At the head of the table sat Lieutenant General Damon Whitaker, a man whose presence commanded the room without effort. His uniform was impeccable, every medal a testament to battles fought and won, every crease pressed to regulation. His steel blue eyes missed nothing, and his aides knew better than to interrupt him unless the stakes were life or death. But when his chief of staff slipped into the room, a phone in hand, the atmosphere shifted. Whitaker's gaze flicked to the screen, his jaw tightening at the name. Rachel Kim, a name from another time, another mission. He raised a hand, cutting the briefing off mid-sentence. Give me the room, he said, his voice low but absolute. No one questioned him. Chairs scraped, laptops snapped shut, and within moments the room was empty, the weight of his authority lingering in the air. Whitaker took the phone, his mind already piecing together the implications of the call. A Bishop coin, Crown Heights Bank. Rachel Kim's voice on the line wasn't just a report, it was a summons, a call to honor a debt that transcended rank or time. He listened, his expression unreadable. But inside, a storm of memories churned. He'd known men like Franklin Mercer, men who carried coins like that, men whose stories were written in blood and silence. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a customer. He was a piece of history, and Whitaker would be damned if he let that history be disrespected. Back at the bank, Franklin sat quietly, his eyes tracing the patterns in the marble floor. He wasn't angry, wasn't pleading, just waiting, as he had so many times before, in places far darker than this sterile lobby. Rachel stood outside, her heart still racing, but a quiet resolve settling over her. She didn't know the full story of the man by the window, but she knew enough. She knew the weight of that coin, the sacrifices it represented, and she knew that soon the bank would understand it too. In the deafening silence of a war room suddenly stripped of its usual chaos, Lieutenant General Damon Whitaker stood alone, a solitary figure amidst the ghosts of past battles. The phone pressed against his ear carried the voice of Rachel, his sharpest operative, her tone taut with urgency. Sir, I'm at Crown Heights First National Bank. There's an elderly man here named Franklin Mercer. He presented a bishop-level challenge coin, and they're laughing at him, calling him a fraud. A beat of silence hung in the air, heavy with disbelief, before she added, her voice softening with a rare hint of emotion. They have no idea who he is. Whitaker's face remained an unreadable mask, but his breath caught, a fleeting crack in his ironclad control. Mercer, he said slowly, the name rolling off his tongue like a sacred vow. You're certain? Positive, sir. I saw the coin myself, Rachel replied, her voice steady as steel, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He placed the phone down with deliberate care, his movements precise, but his hands that had signed orders for wars and peace, clenched once, hard, betraying the storm raging within. To the world, Franklin Mercer was a nobody, an old man faded into obscurity. To Damon Whitaker, he was everything, a mentor, a beacon, the man who had forged him in the crucible of his youth. Decades ago, Whitaker had been a raw cadet, fresh from the Republic officers course, stationed at a volatile overseas base. He was all ideals and ambition, a young officer who knew every line of doctrine, but none of the raw, jagged truths of war. That's where Mercer entered his life, a grizzled senior officer tasked with teaching green recruits the art of survival in asymmetric warfare. Mercer wasn't the kind to raise his voice or demand attention. He didn't need to. His presence was a quiet force, like gravity itself, drawing the respect of even the highest-ranking officers. They listened because Mercer had lived it, not in theory, but in the blood-soaked, fire-lit chaos of real battlefields. Whitaker remembered one evening vividly, after a humiliating failure in a training simulation. He'd stayed late, resetting the terrain model with the stubborn pride of youth, his frustration burning hotter than the desert sun. Mercer had walked in, his boots silent on the concrete floor, and handed him a worn canteen. "You don't need to be loud to lead," he'd said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Just be there when it counts." That single sentence had carved itself into Whitaker's soul, guiding every step of his career, every decision that led him to the stars on his shoulders. Now, the image of that same man, his mentor, his foundation, standing in a bank lobby, humiliated by ignorant strangers, set Whitaker's blood ablaze. His jaw clenched, not just with anger, but with a fierce, almost sacred loyalty to a man who embodied the quiet, uncelebrated heroism of true service. Mercer had never sought medals or headlines. He'd built the unseen foundations others stood upon. To mock him was to mock every soldier who served without fanfare, whose sacrifices were etched in silence. Whitaker's fury wasn't just personal, it was a defense of that unspoken code. He pressed the intercom with a steady hand, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Get my aide, we're rolling." Seconds later, a uniformed officer burst into the room, sensing the urgency in the general's tone. "General, suit up, we're leaving now." "Crown Heights, First National Bank," Whitaker said, his words clipped. Final. No further explanation was needed. He moved with the controlled ferocity of a storm contained in glass. Silent, deadly, unstoppable. Fury was rare for him, but it burned now, sharp and focused, not just for the insult to his mentor, but for the affront to every unsung hero Mercer represented. Franklin Mercer wasn't just a veteran. He was a blueprint, a living testament to duty. Someone had tried to erase him, and they were about to learn the cost of that mistake. The black SUV pulled up, its engine a low growl, as Whitaker adjusted his uniform. Each pin and ribbon aligned with surgical precision. He stared out the tinted window, his eyes hard as flint. They had no idea what was coming. The vehicle moved like a predator through the city, weaving through traffic without sirens or flashing lights. It didn't need them. Its presence alone, sleek, swift, authoritative, commanded the road. Drivers parted instinctively, sensing the weight of its purpose. Inside, Whitaker sat motionless, a statue carved from resolve, his immaculate uniform a silent declaration of his rank and intent. No briefcase, no entourage, no flag on the hood, just him and his mission. The SUV stopped with a soft crunch of tires against the curb outside Crown Heights First National Bank. Whitaker didn't wait for the driver, stepping onto the sidewalk with a purpose that seemed to charge the air around him. His boots struck the polished tile of the bank lobby like thunderclaps, cutting through the mundane hum of weekday transactions, quiet conversations, clacking keyboards, the idle slurp of coffee. The room froze. Lena, a teller mid-keystroke, stared wide-eyed. Travis Myers, leaning smugly behind the counter, raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering as his gaze landed on the constellation of stars on Whitaker's chest. The room fell silent, curiosity giving way to confusion, then awe as the general's presence rewrote the atmosphere. He didn't scan the room or pause to ask questions. His eyes locked onto his target, and the world seemed to bend to his will. The air inside the bank was thick with the weight of routine, broken only by the measured footsteps of General Whitaker as he crossed the polished marble floor. His stride carried the unyielding rhythm of a man who had navigated battlefields under the unblinking gaze of satellites, who had issued commands in the chaos of war zones, and who had witnessed the final breaths of soldiers whose boots still smoldered from the heat of conflict. His presence demanded attention, not through arrogance, but through the quiet authority of a life forged in sacrifice. He came to a halt before Franklin Mercer, who sat by the window, his weathered hands resting atop a cane, his black cap emblazoned with gold letters proclaiming Vietnam veteran. Frank's posture was unassuming, his gaze steady but distant, as if he were looking through the glass into a past only he could see. Without a sound, Whitaker snapped into a full military salute, the motion slicing through the room like a bolt of lightning. The gesture was sharp, deliberate, and it landed with the force of a thunderclap, silencing the hum of idle chatter and the soft clatter of keyboards. No fanfare accompanied it, no music, no applause, just a profound stillness that wrapped the moment in reverence. Frank's eyes lifted slowly, a flicker of confusion crossing his lined face before it settled into the calm of a man who had faced far greater surprises. With a quiet groan, he rose, his back straightening despite the ache in his shoulders, his salute as crisp as it had been decades ago, though his hand trembled faintly under the weight of time. The motion was a reflex, a memory etched into his bones, as if it had been waiting years to be summoned. Whitaker lowered his arm, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade unsheathed. "Who here," he said, not shouting but with a commanding edge that filled the room, "called Colonel Franklin Mercer a fraud?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. No one dared answer. The silence that followed was no longer one of confusion. It was laced with fear. Travis Meyer, the bank manager, stood behind the counter, his face draining of color, his usual polished confidence unraveling into something brittle. He took a hesitant step back, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came, only the shallow sound of his breath. Lena, the teller, averted her gaze, her cheeks burning with a flush of shame, her fingers fidgeting nervously at her station. Even the security guard, who had been poised near the door, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier authority replaced by a restless unease. Whitaker didn't pause for confessions. He stepped forward, his presence filling the space, and spoke again, this time with the weight of undeniable truth. "This man," he said, his voice steady and resolute, "trained the men who trained me. His name is carved into operations that will never grace the pages of history books because their cost was too steep to be spoken aloud. Today, in this room, you didn't just insult his name, you insulted the legacy of a generation who bled in silence, who carried burdens you'll never comprehend." The words didn't echo, they sank deep, rooting themselves in the hearts of everyone present. The bank, once a place of mundane transactions, felt transformed, as if it had become a hallowed ground where truth had come to settle old scores. Travis's face was a study in collapse, his slick demeanor melting into a quiet panic. His eyes darted frantically, searching for an escape that didn't exist, as if he could outrun the weight of his own words. He stood frozen behind the counter, a man watching his career crumble in agonizing slow motion, each second stretching into eternity. Around the room, the air remained still, heavy with the gravity of the moment. Rachel Kim, a customer standing near the lobby entrance, kept her arms crossed, her jaw tight. Her expression held no trace of satisfaction or triumph, only a steely resolve as she bore witness to justice long overdue. She stood like a sentinel, her silence louder than any words could have been. Whitaker reached into his coat and withdrew a thick, weathered folder, its edges frayed from years of careful preservation. He placed it on the counter with a quiet authority, no flourish or ceremony, just the understated confidence of a man who knew the truth needed no embellishment. "This," he said, flipping it open, "is the original authorization for Operation Hollow Shield, signed by Colonel Mercer himself, declassified 3 years ago." He slid out another document, a scanned image of a brass plaque, its surface gleaming even in the faded print. "Here's the dedication board for Crown Heights Command Base, the original facility that stood on this very land before it became a bank. Look at the name." His finger tapped the paper, drawing every eye to the etched letters, Colonel Franklin J. Mercer. Next came a laminated commendation, its text proclaiming Joint Special Operations Recognition, dated 1972. Finally, he produced a color photograph, its edges slightly curled, showing a younger Frank standing shoulder to shoulder with 3-star generals, his face stoic, his eyes carrying the weight of unspoken stories. The documents weren't meant to dazzle or impress. They were a quiet reminder of a truth that had been buried too long. Their impact was undeniable. Lena's hands hovered over her keyboard, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and guilt, as if she wished she could vanish into the screen before her. Several customers stood with their mouths slightly agape, caught between the urge to speak and the instinct to remain silent out of respect. The security guard, who had earlier moved toward Frank at Travis's command, now stood rigid against the back wall, his chin lifted in a posture that seemed to offer a wordless apology, his earlier misstep weighing heavily on him. Frank, for his part, remained quiet, his expression unreadable, save for the faintest glimmer of weariness in his eyes. He met Whitaker's gaze and gave a subtle nod, a gesture that spoke of camaraderie and understanding forged in places far from this sterile bank lobby. "I didn't come for all this," he said softly, his voice rough but steady, carrying the humility of a man who had never sought recognition. "I came to help my grandson pay for school." The words were simple, but they cut through the tension, grounding the moment in the quiet dignity of his purpose. Whitaker's face softened, though his lips didn't curve into a smile. "Then let's make that happen," he said, his tone warm but resolute. The two men, one clad in the crisp lines of a general's uniform, the other draped in the quiet weight of memory, moved together toward the teller window. Travis stepped back, his movements jerky, as if he were a marionette whose strings had been cut. Lena rose slowly, her fingers trembling as she keyed in the account number, her eyes flicking nervously between the screen and the men before her. The room remained silent, save for the soft hum of the printer as it spat out the withdrawal receipt. Frank took the slip of paper, his hand steady now, and folded it carefully, as if it were more than a transaction. It was a promise kept, a small victory in a life defined by far greater battles. Colonel Franklin Mercer accepted the funds with a quiet dignity that seemed to anchor the room. His weathered hands, steady despite the years, folded the receipt with deliberate care before slipping it into the pocket of his worn coat. No flourish, no grand gesture, just the same unassuming man he'd always been, carrying himself with a humility that belied the weight of his past. As he and General Damon Whitaker turned to leave the bank, Frank paused, his body still, not from fear or shame, but from something deeper, something that stirred in the marrow of his bones. Gratitude. It wasn't just for the money or the correction of a long buried wrong. It was for the moment itself, a rare, fleeting glimpse of justice, of a truth finally acknowledged, of a legacy pulled from the shadows. The weight of memory pressed harder on him now, heavier than any coin or medal, but for the first time in decades he felt seen. That, more than any title or honor, was what he'd quietly yearned for all along. Frank's steps were slower now, each one measured, as if he were carrying not just his own history, but the echoes of those who'd served beside him, comrades lost to time, to war, to indifference. His eyes, sharp beneath the faint lines etched by years of service, scanned the bank's sterile interior, taking in the fluorescent lights, the polished counters, the mundane hum of everyday life. Yet something had shifted. He wasn't invisible anymore. The realization settled into his chest, warm and unfamiliar, like sunlight breaking through a long winter. Rachel Kim, a seasoned military officer with years of service etched into her soul, stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. She'd seen it all, precision strikes that lit up the night sky, tense negotiations in smoke-filled tents, funerals where flags were folded with heartbreaking precision. But nothing had ever struck her like this. Her gaze was fixed on the two men moving toward the exit, General Damon Whitaker, his uniform crisp, his posture radiating authority, and Colonel Franklin Mercer, quiet as ever, yet no longer diminished. There was a gravity to Frank's presence now, a quiet strength that seemed to pull the room into orbit around him. Rachel's breath caught as she watched, her mind racing to process the depth of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just a transaction or a bureaucratic correction. It was restoration, a man wronged, a truth reclaimed, a life of service finally honored. As the two men approached the glass doors, something intangible shifted in the bank. It wasn't the lighting or the air. It was the people. From the far corner, an older man near the ATM stood slowly, his movements deliberate despite the stoop in his shoulders. His gray hair peeked out from beneath a faded ball cap, and his jacket bore the unmistakable insignia of the 1st Marine Division. Without a word, he raised his hand in a slow, resolute salute, his eyes locked on Frank. The gesture was simple but heavy with meaning, a silent acknowledgement of shared sacrifice. One by one, others followed. A retired Navy corpsman lingering by the coffee station with a cup gone cold, straightened and saluted. An Army reservist, clutching a deposit slip in line, snapped to attention. Even a young woman near the customer service desk, dressed in civilian clothes but with a tattoo of dog tags etched on her wrist, rose to her feet, her hand rising in tribute. No order had been given, no announcement made, but every veteran in the room stood tall, heels together, eyes fixed on Frank Mercer. Then, as if pulled by some unspoken force, the civilians joined them. A mother near the teller line tightened her grip on her child's hand, her eyes glistening with quiet awe. An older man in a baseball cap removed it, holding it over his heart. Bank staff stepped away from their screens, their hands falling still. The hum of machinery, the soft clatter of keyboards, the murmur of conversation. All of it faded into silence. This wasn't a spectacle or a performance. It was something deeper, something primal. Respect, long overdue, had returned. Frank stopped mid-step, caught off guard by the weight of the moment. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in each face, each gesture, each quiet nod of recognition. These were strangers, yet they saw him, not the old man in a worn coat, but the soldier who'd served, the leader who'd endured, the man who'd never asked for thanks. His throat tightened, not from tears but from disbelief. For so long he'd carried his service in silence, a private burden he'd never expected anyone to share. Now here, in this ordinary bank on an ordinary day, that burden felt lighter. General Whitaker, sensing the shift, stepped forward, his gloved hand reaching into his coat pocket. From it, he produced a small velvet box, simple, dark, unadorned but elegant in its restraint. "Colonel," he said, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of years of camaraderie and promises kept. "We've held on to this for a long time. Thought today might be the day you'd want it back." He opened the lid, revealing a circular medallion, its surface gleaming despite the years. It was unblemished, engraved not with ranks or battle names, but with 3 simple words beneath Frank's full name: "Service beyond record." The phrase captured more than any decoration could, a lifetime of quiet duty, of sacrifices uncounted, of honor unspoken. Frank stared at the medallion, his breath slowing as memories flooded back. Nights under fire, letters never sent, faces he'd never forget. No words came, no tears either. Just a long, steady exhale, as if he were releasing decades of weight. He nodded once, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone but Whitaker. His fingers reached out, not with haste or greed, but with a quiet purpose, closing the box with a soft snap. He slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, where a challenge coin had rested just moments before. Then he met Whitaker's gaze and said simply, "It's done." The words carried a finality that needed no explanation. Whitaker nodded, understanding the depth of what had just passed between them. A promise fulfilled, a legacy restored, a lifetime of dignity finally acknowledged. Frank turned toward the doors, his steps steady but lighter now, as if the weight of invisibility had lifted at last. Rachel, still standing motionless, felt a tear slip down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, her voice barely above a whisper, as she spoke to no one in particular. "That's how you honor a man like that." No one in the room, not even those who'd been skeptical or dismissive earlier, could argue with her. The moment was too raw, too real. In the weeks that followed, Crown Heights First National Bank was forever changed. The story of that day spread quietly at first, shared in hushed tones among employees over coffee breaks, then in posts on X that caught fire online. Eventually it reached the corporate office, which recognized the gravity of their oversight. They issued a formal statement, but words alone weren't enough. They took action, implementing mandatory veteran awareness training across all branches. Every employee, from tellers to executives, was required to complete a program on recognizing and respecting those who'd served. The bank wasn't just a place of transactions anymore. It had become a place where a quiet truth had been reclaimed and where respect, once lost, had been restored. The weight of a lifetime service doesn't always announce itself. For Colonel Franklin J. Mercer, it lingered in the creases of his weathered hands, in the measured steps he took into the bank that day, and in the quiet resolve that had carried him through wars and decades. He wasn't there to demand recognition. He didn't expect the young teller to understand the faded documents he presented, his military discharge papers, brittle with age, proof of a life spent in service. All he wanted was to resolve a simple banking issue, to secure a loan for his grandson Peter's college tuition. But the moment the teller dismissed those papers with a glance, something shifted inside Frank. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was the ache of being unseen, of having the sacrifices that defined him reduced to irrelevant scraps of paper. He stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if willing himself to stay composed. Deep down, he wondered if this was what it meant to grow old in a world that had moved on, if the dignity he'd earned was now just a relic, like the medals tucked away in his drawer at home. The teller's supervisor didn't help. Her impatience cut deeper, her tone clipped, as she questioned the validity of Frank's credentials. To her, he was just another customer, another problem to be processed. She didn't see the man who'd led soldiers through chaos, who'd carried the weight of decisions that cost lives, who'd returned home to build a quiet life without ever asking for praise. Frank's chest tightened, not with pride, but with a weary kind of sorrow. He'd faced worse than this: battlefields, loss, the long nights of wondering if he'd done enough. But here, in this sterile bank lobby, the dismissal stung in a way he hadn't expected. He thought of Peter, his grandson, whose future rested on this moment, and he swallowed the urge to walk away. For Peter's sake, he has stayed, his silence louder than any protest could have been. But someone else saw. Rachel Kim, a mid-level manager at the bank, had been watching from her office. She didn't know Frank's story, not yet, but she recognized the posture of a man who'd carried more than most. Maybe it was the way he held those papers, not with entitlement, but with quiet insistence, as if they were a piece of himself. Or maybe it was the flicker of hurt in his eyes when the supervisor brushed him off. Rachel felt a knot in her stomach, a mix of shame and anger, not at Frank, but at the system that had failed him, at her colleagues who'd forgotten what respect looked like. She thought of her own father, a veteran who'd rarely spoken of his service, but whose pride had shaped her. Rachel couldn't stay silent. She stepped into the lobby, her heart racing, and asked to see Frank's documents herself. What followed wasn't just a correction of a clerical error. It was a reckoning. Rachel read the papers carefully, her fingers tracing the typed lines that detailed Frank's rank, his years of service, his sacrifices. Her voice softened as she spoke to him, not with pity, but with reverence. She apologized, not just for the bank's mistake, but for the oversight that had made a man like him feel small. And then she did something no one expected. She called the bank's regional director, a retired general, and explained the situation. The director arrived within the hour, his face grim with understanding. When he saw Frank, he didn't hesitate. He saluted, a crisp, deliberate gesture that silenced the room. The lobby, bustling moments before, seemed to hold its breath. For Frank, that salute was more than recognition. It was a mirror, reflecting back the man he'd been, the leader he'd become, the soldier he'd never stopped being. His eyes glistened, but he didn't flinch. He returned the salute, his movement slow but sure, and for the first time that day, he felt whole again. The moment didn't just change Frank's day, it rippled outward, touching lives in ways no one could have foreseen. Rachel couldn't let it end there. The weight of what she'd witnessed stayed with her, heavy and unresolved, like a stone in her chest. She lay awake that night thinking of the veterans she'd met over the years, men and women whose stories were too often ignored, whose needs were lost in the complexities of modern life. She felt a fire kindling inside her, a need to do more than apologize. Using her connections in the defense community, Rachel founded the Mercer Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to helping veterans navigate the labyrinth of financial systems. She named it after Frank, not because he'd asked for it, but because his quiet dignity had shown her what was possible when someone cared enough to act. The fund's mission was clear. No one who'd served their country should ever feel abandoned by it. Rachel poured her heart into the work, driven by the memory of Frank's face, the way his shoulders had straightened when he was seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. For Peter, Frank's grandson, the impact was even deeper, more profound. He'd always known his grandfather was a soldier, but the stories had been fragments, half-told memories shared over fishing trips or quiet dinners. Watching the news clips of that day, hearing the stories spread through neighbors' whispers and local headlines, Peter saw his grandfather in a new light. It wasn't the general's salute that moved him most, nor was it the medals that were mentioned in the reports. It was the way Frank had walked away afterward, his head high but his demeanor unchanged, as if the recognition had been a gift he didn't need. Peter felt a lump in his throat, a mix of pride and awe and something else, a quiet call to live up to the man his grandfather was. That fall he enrolled at in ROTC, not because anyone expected it of him, but because he wanted to carry forward the honor he'd seen in Frank's silence. Every class, every drill, felt like a promise to be someone worthy of that legacy. Back at the bank, the story left a lasting mark, one etched in stone. Near the main entrance, a new inscription was added beneath the original dedication plaque. It read, Franklin J. Mercer, Colonel, United States Army, Honor and Silence. No list of battles, no tally of awards, just the essence of a man whose life had spoken for itself. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a truth too often overlooked. Some legacies don't need fanfare. Frank's wasn't built on the noise of his achievements, but on the stillness he left behind, a quiet that invited others to listen, to reflect, to remember. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voices, the fastest lives, Frank's story is a reminder of something enduring, the strength of those who serve without seeking the spotlight. His dignity didn't need banners or viral posts. It was woven into the fabric of his choices, his sacrifices, his steadfast presence. That single moment of respect in a bank lobby didn't just change how one man was seen. It shifted perspectives, rekindled pride, and inspired action that would touch lives for years to come. It showed us that honor isn't always in the grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see the heroes among us, the ones who walk past every day, carrying their stories in silence.